For generations, we looked up at the night sky and wondered, are we the only ones out here? We sent signals into the void, like messages in a bottle, hoping someone would find them. But all we ever got back was silence. Then, one day, something found us. Beyond the orbit of the farthest planet, space itself started to rip open, bleeding glowing purple light into the darkness. This is the story of how the biggest bully in the galaxy tried to steal our lunch money and got the surprise of his life. You're going to want to hear how this ends. Through those tears in space, the ships poured out. They were massive, each one a kilometer of polished black metal gliding with a terrifying silent grace, their hulls bristling with weapons that glowed with deadly energy. These weren't explorers. They were conquerors. The Vareth Dominion had come to call. From the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, High Commander Vorath Kul watched the tiny blue world get bigger on his view screen. He was a mountain of a creature, with skin like cracked stone and 4 blazing orange eyes that danced with cold amusement. The armor he wore wasn't just metal, it was crafted from the bones of every species he'd ever driven to extinction. It was a trophy case he wore to work. Every single bone was a souvenir from a world that was now just dust and memories. He stared at the little blue marble on the screen. Earth. A pathetically simple name for a simple little world. His spies had watched these humans for 6 months, learning their primitive languages and mapping their tiny cities. He knew all about their toys, nuclear missiles, fighter jets, tanks. Vorath had actually laughed out loud when he read the intelligence reports. His ships could fly through the heart of a sun. His soldiers wore armor that could shrug off an asteroid impact. These humans were like toddlers playing in a sandbox while his empire stretched across 1,000 galaxies. "Torinth, what's the latest count?" Vorath asked his second-in-command, a warrior whose face was a roadmap of battle scars. "How many worlds have fallen to the Dominion?" 247, High Commander. Torinth's voice rumbled like an earthquake. "Earth will make it 248. "Hardly worth getting out of bed for," Vorath sighed, looking bored. "But the planet has some decent resources. We'll strip mine it and put what's left of the population to work in the spice fields." The invasion fleet was enormous, 9,900 ships in total. It was the largest force the Dominion had ever sent for such a weak target. Normally, 100 ships would have been overkill, but Vorath had stayed alive for 300 years of non-stop war by never underestimating an enemy. Besides, his new recruits needed some target practice. A lot of them were fresh from the academy and had never been in a real fight. Earth would be a perfect training ground to let them get their hands bloody. Let them learn how to kill here, so they'd be ready for the real wars that mattered. "Open a channel," Vorath commanded. "Broadcast this on all of their frequencies in every one of their silly little languages." His officer complied, sending a message hurtling toward Earth, the same cold final demand that 247 other worlds had heard just before they ceased to exist. "People of Earth, I am High Commander Vorath of the Vareth Dominion. Your world is now our property. Surrender your weapons, surrender your leaders, do exactly as you are told. If you comply, you will live out your lives as our servants. If you resist, we will erase you from history. You have 1 day to make your choice. We will not warn you again." 7 hours later, that message hit Earth like a tidal wave. It hijacked every television station, every radio broadcast, every military comms channel. In minutes, every government on the planet knew that the end had arrived. At the United Nations, world leaders scrambled into a frantic, desperate meeting. They stared at the screens showing the alien fleet, a swarm of death getting closer with every passing second. "We must surrender," the French representative said, his voice trembling. "Look at the size of that fleet. We cannot fight that. We can't even scratch their paint." "Surrender is just a polite word for slavery," the American president shot back. Her name was Sarah Chen. She was a former Marine who had lost her husband in a war 20 years prior. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes were blazing. "I was not elected to hand over the human race to some cosmic bully." And what is your alternative, Madam President? The Russian leader countered. Our nuclear arsenal is like a collection of firecrackers against ships like those. Our armies might as well be throwing rocks. A small, dangerous smile played on President Chen's lips. Let me tell you all a little story, she said. 70 years ago, something not from this world crashed in the New Mexico desert. Our government found it. Our scientists took it apart. And for the last 7 decades, our engineers have been very, very busy. She tapped her tablet, and the main screen behind her lit up, displaying blueprints for weapons and starships, technology that was light years ahead of anything the public knew about. We called it Project Lazarus, Chen explained, and every major nation in this room has its own version of it. We've been getting ready for this day for generations. We never knew if they'd come in peace or for war, so we planned for war. You could have heard a pin drop in that chamber. Leaders who had been on the verge of giving up were now sitting bolt upright, their eyes wide. A tiny spark of hope had just been ignited in humanity's darkest hour. Show us, the Chinese president said, his voice filled with urgency. Show us what we have. Chen nodded to a general standing near the door, an old, scarred soldier with the piercing eyes of a hawk. The name's General Marcus Stone, he said, his voice raspy like grinding stones. I've been running Project Lazarus for 30 years. Everything you think you know about our military capabilities is a carefully constructed lie. Allow me to show you the truth. For the next 2 hours, he laid it all out. The fusion-powered railgun cannons hidden on the dark side of the moon. The secret fleet of 62 advanced warships, built in massive underground caverns and at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, a fusion of human grit and reverse-engineered alien tech. He told them about the Shiva missiles, weapons that didn't just explode. They created miniature black holes that devoured everything they touched. We have 12,000 of them, Stone said, his expression grim. That's enough to snuff out a star. Why were we kept in the dark about this? The British Prime Minister demanded. We've been squabbling over borders and oil while you held the fate of the entire planet in your hands? Because the only way to keep a secret that big, President Chen cut in smoothly, is to make damn sure almost no one knows it exists. Every nation here has its own Lazarus project. We've been sharing data secretly for decades, coordinating our hidden defenses without ever speaking of it openly. We always suspected someone might be listening in. She glanced upward, as if she could see straight through the roof to the stars above. And we were right. They've been spying on us for 6 months. They see us as weak, divided, an easy mark. That dangerous smile returned. They are about to have a very, very bad day. Millions of miles away, Vorath was growing impatient. It had been 20 hours since his ultimatum. The humans had not replied. Perhaps their technology is too primitive to send a signal so far, Torrance offered, or they failed to comprehend the message. They have radio, Vorath snapped. They've been polluting the galaxy with their awful music for a century. They can answer. They are choosing not to. This was unusual. Every other species had responded instantly, either pleading for their lives or trying to negotiate a surrender. But these humans were just quiet. What in the 7 hells are they doing down there? He wondered aloud. He commanded his scout ships to move in for a closer look. The reports that came back only deepened his confusion. High Commander, they're going dark, a pilot reported over the comms. Their satellite network is shutting down. Global communications are offline. It's almost like they're trying to hide from us. Vorath let out a harsh, grating laugh. Hide? From me? There isn't a rock on that mudball big enough for them to hide behind. But as his laughter died down, a tiny splinter of doubt pricked at his ancient mind. In 300 years of conquest, he'd seen it all. He'd seen races fight to the last soul. He'd seen them flee in terror. He'd seen them grovel. But he had never, ever seen a species just go completely silent. Down on Earth, the final pieces were moving into place. The Lazarus protocols were now active worldwide. Soldiers who had spent their entire lives training for a war they were told would never happen were now moving to their stations. Weapons that, on paper, did not exist were being aimed at the heavens. In a quiet farmhouse in Montana, a 60-year-old farmer named Jack Wilson was watching the news report. With hands as tough as worn leather and a face carved by the sun, he figured his fighting days were long behind him. Then his phone buzzed. A voice on the other end spoke a simple code phrase he had memorized 40 years ago but never thought he'd actually hear. "Lazarus is rising," the voice said. "Report to Station 7. Jack clicked off the TV. He walked out to his old barn, over to a rusty tractor that hadn't moved in years. Reaching under the seat, he pulled out a key he had carried in his pocket every single day for 4 decades. Behind the barn, buried under a slab of concrete and years of dirt and grass, was a hidden steel hatch. Jack's key unlocked it. An elevator inside carried him deep into the earth. 15 minutes later, the doors hissed open into a sprawling secret base, thrumming with contained power. Hundreds of soldiers were already there, prepping futuristic gear, glowing rifles that hummed with energy. A young officer spotted him and did a double-take. "Sergeant Wilson? Sir, I thought you retired 20 years ago." "I made a promise, and I'll be damned if I break it," James growled, his voice a low rumble over the comms. He scanned the faces of the other soldiers crammed into the command center, their features illuminated by the eerie blue light from the tactical screens. Some were just kids, barely old enough to buy a drink, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and raw determination. Others were grizzled veterans like him, their faces etched with the lines of wars long past. But they all shared one thing, a cold, quiet fury. "So what's the game plan?" James asked the officer on the main display. "We wait," the voice crackled in response. "We let 'em get cocky, let 'em get nice and close. Then we unleash hell, and we don't stop shooting until they're space dust, or we are." James gave a slow, deliberate nod. He could live with that. Simple was good. "Sounds like my kind of party," he said. "Count me in." Far above, the silent stars bore witness as the enemy armada closed in. A tidal wave of death about to crash against a world that was coiled, waiting, and ready to strike. On the bridge of his flagship, High Commander Varathkal made up his mind as his fleet screamed past Mars's orbit. "I've grown tired of this little game," he announced to his bridge crew. "Deploy the Vanguard. 400 ships. Their mission is to obliterate their military hubs and level their largest cities. It is time we taught these primitives the price of defiance." His second-in-command, Torrance, shifted uneasily. "Sir, their complete radio silence is unsettling. Perhaps we should dispatch a recon drone first to get a look at what we're walking into?" Varathkal waved a dismissive hand. "I have conquered 2,000 worlds, Torrance. I don't need to look at what these creatures have. I need only to shatter their will. Launch the Vanguard, now." As commanded, 400 of the most lethal ships in his armada broke from the main formation, streaking toward the small blue world. They were the fastest vessels he possessed, armed with plasma cannons that could turn mountains to slag and carrying thousands of warriors hungry for conquest. They crossed the moon's orbit at precisely 0347 Greenwich Mean Time. At 0348, the moon shot back. The first shot was a 50-meter rod of solid tungsten, a colossal metal telephone pole fired from a hidden cannon at 8% of the speed of light. Moving at that velocity, it struck with more kinetic energy than any nuclear weapon humanity had ever conceived. It slammed into the lead alien vessel before its crew even registered the threat. The ship didn't explode. It simply vanished. One moment, it was a masterpiece of alien engineering. The next, it was an expanding cloud of superheated plasma. A second later, the sky filled with more slugs. 10, then 20, then 50, then 100. They erupted from what appeared to be dead craters, from silent mountain ranges, and from secret installations that the world's governments had spent decades denying ever existed. 12 of Varathkal's ships ceased to be in the first 3 seconds. On the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, every alarm shrieked to life. "What in the 7 hells is happening?" Varathkal roared. "Report now!" Torrance's eyes were as wide as saucers. "It's their moon! They've turned their entire moon into a weapon! Those are railguns, High Commander, firing slugs at .08 light speed. Our shields can't possibly—" he was cut short by an even more piercing siren. From the surface of Earth itself, thousands of missiles were rocketing up to meet them. But these weren't the clumsy projectiles the invaders had anticipated. These things moved, strangely. They seemed to shimmer, phasing in and out of view, zigzagging in patterns that utterly baffled the targeting computers. "I can't get a weapon lock," a tactical officer yelled. "It's like they're warping space. Our sensors can't track them." The ghostly missiles impacted the vanguard and began to pop. But there was no fire, no blast. Instead, they bloomed into spheres of pure darkness. At the point of impact, a tiny ball of absolute nothingness flickered into existence for a fraction of a second. In that single instant, it devoured everything it touched: starships, energy shields, reinforced armor, and the unfortunate souls trapped inside. Nothing was left behind. Vorathkol watched in stunned disbelief as his elite vanguard was shredded. Ships that had survived legendary campaigns against entire star-faring empires were being erased like chalk on a sidewalk in a rainstorm. Crews that had subjugated planets were dying without even knowing what hit them. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Those weapons, their singularities, tiny, man-made black holes. That kind of technology shouldn't even be possible," Torrance whispered beside him. "Even our most brilliant scientists haven't cracked that." But the humans had. For 70 years, they had toiled in secret labs buried deep beneath mountains and hidden under the crushing pressure of the deep sea. They had failed 1,000 times over. They had accidentally wiped entire research facilities from existence in terrible accidents. But they never stopped. They kept experimenting, kept innovating, and kept building. And now, they were finally unleashing their terrifying new creations on the enemy that had come to put them in chains. 90 minutes after the moon opened up, the vanguard was annihilated. Of the 400 ships that had so arrogantly charged forward, fewer than 200 managed to limp away, their crews screaming frantic warnings over the comms that sounded like the ravings of madmen. Vorathkol collapsed into his command chair, all four of his eyes wide with a profound shock he had never known. In 300 years of conquest, he had never lost a single battle. In 300 years, he had never been so completely blindsided. In one night, these humans had accomplished both. Torrance approached him cautiously. "Hi, Commander. What are your orders?" Vorathkol was silent for a long, heavy minute. He considered retreating. He considered proceeding with caution. He considered every strategic lesson he had ever learned. And then he thought of the Dominion Council back on the homeworld and what they did to commanders who returned in defeat, especially after being bested by a species they had written off as primitives. His expression hardened, the shock morphing into pure, unadulterated rage. "All ships," he commanded, his voice as cold as the void between stars. "Full-scale assault. Every weapon, every soldier. We will overwhelm them with brute force. We will bury them under a mountain of fire." He rose to his feet, his hands clenched into tight fists. "I don't care how many ships we lose. I don't care how many of our own people die," he snarled. "We will scorch this world until nothing remains but ash and echoes." The command ripped through the fleet. 9,000 warships began their grim advance toward Earth, their weapon ports glowing with deadly energy, their crews steeling themselves for the fight of their lives. They had no clue they were flying straight into a meat grinder. They had no clue that the vast majority of them would never see their homes again. They had no clue they had just started a war with a species that would rather burn its own world to a cinder than ever kneel. And down on the lunar surface, an old soldier named Captain James Morrison watched the enemy fleet flood his tactical displays and allowed himself a grim, tight smile. His railguns were humming, his teams were ready, and the enemy was walking right into his kill box. "You wanted a war," he muttered into the darkness of the command center. "Congratulations, you got one. Now let's find out who's willing to bleed more." He slammed his fist down on a large red button, and the moon's cannons began to sing their terrifying song once more. The true war for Earth had just begun. The space around the planet was already a junkyard. Twisted fragments of metal that were once state-of-the-art warships tumbled through the black. Bodies, frozen solid in the vacuum of space, drifted silently through the debris field. Inside shattered hulls, fires still raged where pockets of atmosphere lingered. It was a scene from a nightmare, and it was only the beginning. High Commander Vorthkol stood on his bridge, watching his colossal fleet descend. 9,000 warships, a tidal wave of steel and fury moving in perfect lethal formation. The burning wreckage of his vanguard fleet trailing behind them was a grim testament to the battle ahead.
"Status report now!"
Vorthkol demanded.
"The moon's defenses remain active," Torrance reported, his voice strained. "They've already taken out another 60 ships on our approach. Our shields are buckling under the strain of those slugs. We're diverting almost all power just to keep them operational." "We won't need them for much longer," Vorthkol snapped. "Order the assault carriers to commence landing operations. I want our soldiers on the ground. Let's see how these humans fight when we are face to face." He smirked, revealing a row of sharp, predatory teeth. On the ground, his warriors were unstoppable forces. No secret space cannon was going to save the humans from millions of Varath shock troopers clad in advanced battle armor. The massive assault carriers peeled off from the main fleet and plunged into the atmosphere. Each one was a flying fortress, carrying 10,000 soldiers and hundreds of war machines. Their armor was engineered to withstand orbital bombardment, their shields designed to repel any weapon the humans had revealed so far. At least, that's what the Varath believed. In a command bunker buried miles beneath Washington, D.C., President Sarah Chen monitored the enemy's descent on a wall of screens. "They're making landfall," General Stone said, his voice a low growl. "We have 12 carriers touching down in North America alone. We're tracking more across Europe, Asia, and Africa. They're attempting to strike us on all fronts simultaneously." Imagine being so desperate, so backed into a corner, that your only option is to unleash literal nightmares upon the world to save it. That was the choice facing President Chen, and her voice was as cold and quiet as the void between stars when she gave the order. "We fight them everywhere, all at once. Unleash every last Lazarus unit we have. And General," she said, pausing for effect. "Yes, Madam President," he replied. "You are authorized to initiate Protocol Chimera. Let our people know the gloves are off. No rules, no limits, whatever it takes." The general gave a sharp nod. He knew exactly what that meant. They were about to deploy secret weapons so horrifying they were never meant to be used, some designed for alien threats, others for human wars so terrible no one ever dared start one. Until now. Stick around, because you won't believe how this underdog story ends. The first alien dropship touched down in the Nevada desert, right in the crater of melted glass that used to be Las Vegas. The city was already a ghost town, obliterated in the first surprise attack, its famous neon strip now just a dark scar of ash and rubble. The aliens, called the Varath, thought it was the perfect landing zone, flat, open, and ideal for assembling their armies. They had no idea the desert itself was a predator, waiting to devour them. Commander Rexeth was the first one to clank down the ramp. For a Varath officer, he was just a kid, only 80 years old, and his armor was polished to a mirror shine, having never seen a real firefight. He was hungry for a taste of glory. "Fan out," he roared at his troops. "Secure the perimeter. At dawn, we march on the closest human settlement." His soldiers spread out with the flawless efficiency of a battle-hardened army, weapons raised, helmet sensors sweeping the silent wasteland. They found nothing. The desert was dead quiet. Just sand, rocks, and the twisted skeletons of old buildings. Rexeth scoffed. Where were the humans? Had they run away? Were these primitives really so cowardly they wouldn't even try to fight? And that's when the entire desert floor erupted. It was a minefield, thousands of them, hidden just an inch under the sand. But these weren't your average explosives. They unleashed focused plasma blasts, crippling electromagnetic pulses, and concentrated light beams that sliced through Varath armor like it was tissue paper. In the first few seconds, hundreds of his soldiers were simply vaporized. The comm channels flooded with screams and a hurricane of static as soldiers dropped and never got up again. "It's a trap!" Rexith yelled into his helmet. "Take cover! Fire back!"
But there was nothing to shoot at. The mines were fully automated, triggered by movement and heat. The humans who planted them were miles away in hardened bunkers, watching the entire slaughter on their monitors. Then came the drones. They were tiny, no bigger than a hummingbird, and they swarmed in by the thousands, darting around so fast the Verath sensors could barely register them. Each one carried just a tiny bit of high explosive wrapped around a single metal pellet. Alone, it was a firecracker. But together, they were a storm of pure death that crashed right into the alien ranks. They zipped into the tiny gaps in the aliens' armor, flew straight into their breathing vents, and slipped into the soft tissue where a helmet meets the neck. They detonated in small, precise bursts of fire and shrapnel, killing not with brute force, but with the deadly accuracy of a surgeon's scalpel. Rexith could only watch in horror as his army was taken apart piece by piece. He had landed with 2,000 soldiers. Less than 10 minutes later, over half of them were gone. The survivors were pinned down, hiding behind rocks and wreckage, firing blindly at an enemy they couldn't even see. "I need orbital support right now," Rexith screamed. "We need a full bombardment. We need—" A single drone flew directly into his open mouth. He never finished the sentence. All across the globe, the same nightmare was unfolding. The Verath came looking for an easy conquest. Instead, they walked into a planet-sized death trap. In Germany, human soldiers in advanced exoskeletons ambushed a landing party deep within the Black Forest. They moved like ghosts among the ancient trees, materializing out of the shadows to fire one perfect, devastating shot before melting back into the darkness. The Verath couldn't hit them. They couldn't even track them. Every time they thought they had a human cornered, they were already gone. In China, the invasion force landed in the Gobi Desert, only to be met by 1 million human soldiers dug into fortified trenches. But these weren't just walls of concrete and steel. They were built from smart materials that could repair themselves in real time, constantly shifting and reforming to absorb or deflect enemy attacks. The Verath threw everything they had at those walls, and the walls just held. Down in Brazil, the Amazon rainforest itself seemed to wake up, transforming into a massive jungle of deadly traps and hidden ambushes. Trees were rigged to explode if you got too close. The rivers were laced with a chemical agent that dissolved Verath armor on contact. Even the animals had been turned into weapons, fitted with tiny cameras and explosive charges, turning the entire jungle into a living, breathing minefield. It didn't matter where the Verath landed. The humans fought with a ferocity that was completely beyond their understanding. Aboard the flagship, the Eternal Conquest, High Commander Vorthal watched the casualty reports pour in. His face was an unreadable mask of stone, but inside, his mind was reeling. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. "This is completely impossible." "We've lost 200,000 soldiers in the first day," his second-in-command reported, his voice trembling. "Commander Rexith is gone. So are Commanders Yexath, Belor, Seneth, and 47 other ranking officers. Our ground troops are begging for immediate extraction." "Denied," Vorthal said flatly. "They will hold their ground. Send in the reinforcements." "High Commander, if we send more soldiers down there, they'll just be walking into a meat grinder. The humans have turned their entire planet into a weapon. Every forest, every desert, every city is a kill box. We can't fight an enemy we can't find." "Then we'll burn away their hiding places," Vorthal snarled. "We will turn their deserts into glass. We will level every single city until there is nowhere left for them to hide." He spun to face his weapons officer. "Begin orbital bombardment. Maximum power. I want that entire planet scrubbed from existence." The officer paused. "Sir, our orders from the Council were to secure the planet, not destroy it." "The Council isn't here," Vorthal snapped. "I am, and I am ordering you to burn it all." The command went out. Across the entire invasion fleet, massive plasma cannons began to whine as they charged up. Targeting systems locked onto cities, forests, and oceans. The Verath were about to erase Earth from the galaxy. But the humans had one last surprise up their sleeve. Deep inside a bunker buried under the Rocky Mountains, a bunker built to survive nuclear Armageddon, Admiral Chen Wei watched the enemy fleet power up. She was the commander of Earth's secret space force, a fleet of 62 warships built in total secrecy over the last 40 years. She also happened to be President Chen's younger sister. "They're charging their primary weapons," her tactical officer said. "We've got about 2 minutes until they fire." "Then we have 2 minutes to show them what real power looks like," Chen Wei replied calmly. "Order all ships to launch, full throttle. Engage attack pattern Omega." "Admiral, we're outnumbered 150 to 1. A direct assault is suicide." "And if we do nothing," she countered, rising from her command chair, "Earth is finished." She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she stood with the authority of a giant. "I didn't spend my entire life building this fleet just to hide in a hole while my homeworld burns. Launch the ships." "Yes, Admiral." All over the planet, hidden doors slid open. From deep within the mountains of Colorado, from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and from the frozen wastes of Antarctica, a fleet of warships began to rise. They were pitch black, shaped like arrowheads, and coated in a stealth material that made them invisible to Vareth sensors. They were powered by gravity drives, a technology humans had secretly reverse-engineered from that one alien ship that crashed in New Mexico all those years ago. They moved without engine flare, without exhaust, without a sound. They simply rose into the sky, accelerating faster than anything humanity had ever built before. In 3 minutes, they were in orbit. In 4 minutes, they were tearing the enemy fleet apart like paper. The Vareth never knew what hit them. Admiral Chen Wei's flagship, the UES Defiance, fired the first shot. A focused beam of gravitational energy hit a Vareth cruiser and crumpled it like a soda can. The massive warship just folded in on itself, its shields and armor completely useless against a weapon that attacked space itself. "Every ship, full assault!" Admiral Chen Wei's voice rang out. "Go for their weapon arrays. Don't let a single shot touch Earth." The human fleet descended on the Vareth armada like a fury. Our ships were tiny, agile, and outmaneuvered the bulky enemy vessels with ease. We zipped between their colossal battleships, getting in close to blast them at point-blank range where their shielding was weakest. The Vareth frantically tried to return fire, lighting up the void with searing plasma and swarms of missiles. But hitting us was like trying to swat a fly in a hurricane. Our ships dodged and weaved, using experimental gravity drives to pull off maneuvers that defied all known physics. Kill shots that should have connected missed by yards, then by feet, as our pilots pushed their ships far beyond their designed limits. They saw Earth as a pushover, a backward little planet, just sitting there waiting to be conquered. From his command throne, High Commander Vorthel smirked at the little blue world on his view screen, already savoring his triumph. But he made one critical mistake. He thought we were weak. This is the story of how a small band of heroes, completely outmatched and with their backs against the wall, looked oblivion in the face and refused to blink. And you're going to want to stick around to see what happened next. Even when one of their shots actually landed, it never went the way the alien Vareth expected. Take Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo, for example. Just 26 years old, she'd left her home in Lagos to protect her family, training since she was 18 for this very moment. At the helm of her small fighter, the Scorpion, she was targeted by a massive Vareth destroyer. A wave of plasma fire slammed into her. Her shields evaporated in a flash. Alarms blared as the cockpit began to overheat. "Shields are gone," she reported, her voice steady as a rock. "Hull integrity is at 40%, but my weapons are still online." "Eject, Scorpion! That's an order!" her commander screamed over the comms. "No can do," she shot back, pushing the throttle forward. "I'm sending their command ship a little going-away present." The Vareth bridge crew could only stare in stunned silence as the smoking, half-melted human fighter hurtled directly toward them. Their pilot tried to move the gigantic warship, but it was like a whale trying to dodge a torpedo. Sarah lined up the shot, targeting the destroyer's brilliant engine core. At the very last second, she fired everything she had, 4 graviton torpedoes, each powerful enough to crack a small moon. Then she yanked her controls hard, the Scorpion's frame groaning as she flew right through the heart of the explosion that was once the destroyer's engine room. She emerged on the other side, her ship a mangled wreck but miraculously intact. "Target destroyed," she coughed into the radio. "The Scorpion is toast, but I'm good to go for another run." That same brand of beautiful, reckless courage was happening across the entire battlefield. The humans fought with a ferocity the Verith had never witnessed. When their ships took damage, they didn't retreat, they attacked with even more fury. When they ran out of ammo, they used their ships as battering rams. And when there was nothing left to give, pilots would eject and fire their handguns at enemy command decks as they floated past. It was pure, unadulterated insanity. It was a death wish. And it was working. "They just keep coming," Second-in-Command Torrin observed, a hint of awe in his voice. "Every time we take one down, 2 more appear in its place." "What kind of species is this?" High Commander Vorthal snarled. "A species of idiots," he muttered, though for the first time a sliver of doubt crept in. The battle burned across the void for hours. The human fleet was being hammered, our numbers shrinking with each new fireball. But for every one of our ships we lost, we were taking 10 or 12 of theirs with us. The brutal logic of war was turning against the invaders in a way Vorthal had never imagined possible. When the fighting finally subsided for the day, humanity had lost 38 ships. Only 24 were left, all of them heavily damaged and barely operational. But the Verith had lost nearly 800 vessels. As Vorthal stared at the casualty report, he felt an emotion he hadn't known for centuries. It was raw, cold fear. "High Commander, we must pull back," Torrin urged. "Our forces are scattered. We need to regroup." "And let them repair? Let them build more of those suicidal machines?" Vorthal slammed his fist on the control panel. "No, we continue the assault. We will smash their insignificant fleet into cosmic dust." His subordinate looked at him with grim certainty. "Sir, if I may, I've been analyzing their tactics. They will not surrender. They aren't fighting for land or for honor. They're fighting for their very existence. They will choose to be vaporized before they give up." Vorthal sneered. "Then we will gladly oblige them." "I know," the officer said softly. "But how many of us will they drag into the abyss with them?" Down on Earth, President Chen reviewed the terrible casualty list. 38 ships, thousands of our best and brightest were gone forever. But for now, the enemy's orbital bombardment had stopped. "How long did they buy us?" she asked General Stone, her voice thick with sorrow. "A few days," he said, his face etched with weariness. "A week if we get a miracle. But we're almost out of Shiva missiles. After that, we're basically defenseless." Chen squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back a surge of hopelessness. She knew they couldn't win a war of attrition, but she also knew her people would fight to the very last. It's who we are. "Don't stop fighting," she commanded, her voice turning to iron. "Make them pay for every single inch of this planet with their own blood." On the tactical display, she could see her own sister's flagship, the Defiance. It was battered and scarred, but its beacon was still lit. A small, defiant smile touched her lips. "Give them hell, sis," she whispered. "Make sure they never forget us." The Verith had arrived expecting an easy conquest. They were only now beginning to understand that they'd just kicked the galaxy's most stubborn hornet's nest. In the silence of space, both fleets licked their wounds. The Verith summoned thousands more ships from their reserves. The humans used whatever they could find to patch up their last 24 fighters, reloading every weapon they had left. The final act was about to begin. The second day dawned with a storm of fire. "Every ship, every weapon, every soldier," High Commander Vorthal ordered. "We will choke this planet on its own ashes." He aimed a clawed finger at the serene blue globe. "Target their population centers. I want to hear their screams from orbit. I want them to know all hope is lost." A fleet of 9,000 Verith warships surged forward, a tidal wave of pure destruction. The moon's defense grid fired until its barrels melted, but it was no use. And flying out to meet that apocalyptic wave were the last 24 ships of the human race. It wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a last stand. Aboard the Defiance, Admiral Chen Wei knew this was a one-way trip. Her entire crew knew it too, and they flew out anyway. "All remaining ships," she ordered, her voice unshakable, "focus fire on their troop transports. If this is our last day, we're going to make sure as many of them as possible join us." The Defiance led the desperate charge, its hull a patchwork of emergency repairs. Half its weapon systems were offline. Its shields were flickering. None of that mattered. "Fire," Chen Wei said. A lance of pure gravitational energy shot from the ship, crumpling a Varath carrier like a tin can. And then came the first surprise. The missile bays opened, launching the very last of their Shiva-class weapons. But these weren't your average warheads. This was humanity's hidden ace, our big reveal. As the missiles approached the Varath fleet, they didn't detonate. They popped open, releasing a shimmering, invisible cloud. It was a swarm of nanites, billions upon billions of microscopic robots with a single, simple program: consume and replicate using Varath technology. The swarm washed over the enemy fleet like a ghost. And then, all at once, the Varath armada began to attack itself. Turrets fired on their own ships, engines overloaded and exploded, life support systems shut down. The most advanced fleet in the galaxy was being eaten alive from the inside out, turned into a weapon against itself. The first and only human ship to be destroyed that day, the Spirit of Tokyo, took 300 enemy vessels with it when its captain, Hiroshi Tanaka, deliberately plowed his dying ship into the fleet's largest carrier. After that, the battle was over. The Varath fleet was a self-destructing cascade of chaos. From the bridge of his disintegrating flagship, Vorthol saw the tiny Defiance appear on his main screen. Admiral Chen Wei stared back at him, not with rage, but with a look of cold, hard pity. "You really should have just left us alone," was all she said before his screen, and his life went dark. Earth was safe. The price of victory was devastatingly high, but it sent a clear message to the rest of the universe. Never, ever assume that a cornered animal is a weak one. Humans might be small, but they will never, ever surrender. First, the beacon for the Pride of Nigeria winked out. Then the Moscow's Fury. Then the Amazon Dawn. One by one, the lights representing humanity's final hope were extinguished. Their crews fought until their last breath, their cannons firing until they melted, never once considering surrender. From her command chair, Admiral Chen Wei watched her fleet being systematically annihilated. She had prepared for this. She had accepted this as the cost. But there's a world of difference between knowing what's coming and watching it happen. "Admiral," her tactical officer's voice was strained, "we've lost 12 ships. We're down to our last 12. There's no way we can win." "We have to," Chen Wei replied sharply. "Every second we hold them up here is another second our families have down on Earth. That is our victory. Every second we stall gives another million people a chance to live." She glanced at her comms officer, her voice cutting through the static like a razor. "Patch me through to every ship, now!" A moment later, her words echoed across the battered fleet. "I want you all to know how proud I am. No matter what happens in the next few minutes, we've already won." They came here expecting to find sheep. Instead, they found a pack of wolves. That message was like a shot of adrenaline. On a dozen bridges, exhausted crews stood a little taller, a fire rekindling in their eyes. "All ships," Admiral Chen Wei commanded, her gaze locked on the monstrous enemy flagship. "Form on me. We're kicking in their front door. If today is our last day, we're taking their commander down with us." The 12 surviving vessels, trailing smoke and flame, pulled into formation around the Defiance. They were barely holding on, but they formed a flawless spearhead, aimed for one last desperate charge at the heart of the enemy fleet, the command ship Eternal Conquest. From his command throne, Commander Vor watched them approach. He had been observing these absurd humans for hours, and he felt something he hadn't in centuries, a strange flicker of respect. They were completely insane, but they were the most magnificent madmen he had ever encountered. "Sir, they're coming straight for us," his second-in-command stated, pointing out the obvious. 12 ships against our entire armada. It's a suicide run." "Oh, they know," Vor replied, a strange amusement in his voice. "They just don't care. Order all ships to concentrate fire. Let's bring the curtain down on this little drama before it becomes tedious." The entire Vareth fleet swiveled its cannons toward the tiny formation of human ships. Thousands of weapons unleashed a hellstorm of plasma and light directly in their path. The European Unity was the first to vanish in a silent white flash. Then the Cairo Star. Then the Sol Phoenix. Chen Wei didn't so much as blink as she watched her fleet disintegrate, her ship flying straight into the storm. 8 ships left. 7. 6. "Admiral, we're not going to make it," her pilot choked out, his knuckles white on the controls. "There's just too many of them." "Then we'll die trying," Chen Wei said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Maximum speed, all remaining weapons, fire at will." The Defiance shuddered and screamed as enemy fire ripped through its hull. Fires erupted across the decks. The lights flickered and died. Alarms blared from every speaker. 4 ships left. 3, 2, and then it was just the Defiance flying alone. "All friendly ships are gone, Admiral," the tactical officer reported, her voice strangely steady. She'd accepted her fate. They all had. "Distance to the enemy flagship?" Chen Wei asked. 50 kilometers in closing, came the reply. It was too far. Way, way too far. The Defiance was being torn apart, bolt by bolt. It would never reach the Eternal Conquest. Their final, heroic charge was a failure. Or so it seemed. A cold, chilling smile spread across Chen Wei's face. It was the smile of someone holding one last terrifying card to play. "Helm, new target," she ordered. "Bring us about toward that cluster of troop carriers on our right." "Ma'am? You heard me? Do it." The wounded Defiance groaned as it veered away from the flagship, now rocketing toward a dense formation of Vareth ships carrying their invasion forces to Earth. Those ships carried the ground troops meant to finish the job. "Arm the self-destruct sequence," Chen Wei commanded. "Set it for maximum yield." Her first officer stared at her, then his eyes widened as he understood. "Admiral, if we detonate our reactor right in the middle of their landing fleet—" "I know exactly what will happen," she cut him off. "Set the sequence." "Yes, ma'am." The Defiance dove into the swarm of carriers like a vengeful god's thunderbolt. The Vareth threw everything they had at it, but the ship was moving too fast, too erratically. It was a ghost ship on its final journey, and nothing could stop it. Chen Wei stood up from her command chair. She looked at her bridge crew, the brave men and women who had become her family. They looked back, their faces filled with pride, not fear. "It has been an honor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The honor was all ours, Admiral," her first officer replied for all of them. The Defiance plunged into the heart of the carrier fleet, and then Admiral Chen Wei gave her last order. For Earth. The ship's core went critical, unleashing a contained singularity that didn't just explode, it ripped a hole in the fabric of space. It swallowed the nearest carriers, whose own reactors went critical, feeding the black hole and pulling in dozens, then hundreds of Vareth ships, including the distant, horrified flagship. For one brilliant moment, a new star burned in the sky above Earth, a star made of pure defiance. And then there was only silence, and a gaping wound in the Vareth armada. The invasion was broken. The planet was saved. President Chen stood in the command bunker, her face a mask of stone. But inside, her entire world was collapsing. The after-action report was savage. Her own sister, Admiral Chen Wei, had just detonated her flagship, sacrificing the entire human fleet in a final desperate gambit. The explosion was biblical, taking out 12 enemy carriers and crippling 20 more, wiping out nearly 1,000 alien ships, 50,000 Vareth soldiers, gone in the blink of an eye. But it wasn't enough. Our fleet was gone. Nothing stood between the rest of the Verith Armada and Earth. It was an unprovoked attack, a war of extermination, and we were the ultimate underdogs staring at our own extinction. But what the aliens didn't know was that our most powerful weapons were never in space. Stick around to find out how humanity snatches victory from the jaws of certain defeat. When the officer finished his report, the president allowed herself one silent second. Her sister was gone, the last family she had in the world, but grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was the president of Earth, and there was a planet to save. "General Stone, give me the situation," she said, her voice like solid granite. 3 million have already made landfall, ma'am, with more inbound. They're steamrolling our defenses in North America and Europe. He hesitated. "And our other assets? The doomsday protocols we swore we'd never touch?" The general's face was grim. "Madam President, if we activate those, the civilian losses will be astronomical. We're talking about millions of our own people getting caught in the blast." He didn't have to voice the alternative. They both knew what would happen if the Verith took the planet. "Use them," President Chen ordered, her voice as cold as the void between stars. "And may God forgive us." "Yes, Madam President." The weapons she had just unleashed were humanity's darkest secrets, terrifying creations we had built and then prayed we would never have to use. We're not talking about bigger bombs. We're talking about engineered plagues that only targeted Verith DNA, seismic machines that could trigger massive earthquakes under enemy armies, and orbital platforms that could focus the sun's rays into a beam capable of melting a city. These were weapons of absolute final resort. And the kill switch had just been flipped. Miles away in the Nevada desert, a Verith officer named Commander Zareth was cruising in his command tank, dripping with arrogance. His force was unstoppable. 50,000 soldiers and 200 vehicles rolling toward the ruins of Los Angeles. The pathetic humans had scattered before him like insects. Victory was inevitable. And then, the sky itself seemed to ignite. Zareth looked up, confused. The sun. It looked like it was growing brighter, focusing into a single blinding point of light. A beam of pure, shimmering heat shot down from the heavens and struck the center of his tank column. The temperature flash-boiled past anything their advanced armor could handle. Tanks melted into glowing puddles of liquid metal. Soldiers were instantly incinerated inside their own battlesuits. The desert sand beneath them transformed into a massive sheet of obsidian glass. Zareth's tank was on the edge of the beam, and he just managed to crawl out, half of his body scorched black. Lying on the smoldering ground, watching his invincible army literally evaporate, he could only whisper, What is this?" He would never get an answer. A kilometer away, a human sniper hidden in the rubble put a single round through the alien commander's head. And that was just the beginning. All across the globe, the Verith were walking into one nightmare after another. In Moscow, their occupying army suddenly started to gasp and choke, coughing up their own lungs as a bioengineered plague tore through their ranks. 50,000 of them were gone within hours. In Japan, the ground beneath a major Verith base began to tremble violently. Our tectonic weapons, buried deep underground decades ago, had been switched on, ripping open giant chasms that swallowed soldiers and tanks whole. And in Africa, invisible swarms of nanobots descended upon an entire Verith army. These microscopic machines were programmed with a single, horrifying purpose: to consume Verith biology and technology. They ate through armor plating as if it were paper, then moved on to the flesh and bone underneath. An army of 100,000 soldiers was reduced to a field of clean, white skeletons in less than an hour. The Verith had come prepared for nuclear bombs and missile strikes. They had no idea we had turned our entire planet into one giant, horrific death trap. Aboard their command ship, High Commander Vorthel was losing his mind. What are they doing? What are these weapons? His scientists were in a panic. High Commander, it seems the humans have been planning for this for decades. These weapons are engineered specifically for our species. The plague, the nanites, they're targeting our unique genetic code. Even the seismic generators, one analyst stammered. They were planted in the exact locations our invasion models predicted we would assemble our troops. How could they possibly have known? High Commander Vorthol roared. The scientist just shook his head in disbelief. They didn't. They put them everywhere. Commander, their entire planet is a weapon. A cold, terrifying dread washed over Vorthol. He had already lost more than 1,000 ships and nearly 1 million soldiers, and they had barely managed to establish a single beachhead. We need to withdraw, his second-in-command insisted. Let's regroup, figure out these defenses, and come back with a real plan.
No, Vorthol shouted. We're in too deep. The Dominion Council will execute us for a failure this catastrophic.
He whipped around to face the communications officer, his eyes blazing with a terrifying mix of rage and panic. Order all remaining ships to commence a full-scale orbital bombardment. I want you to hit everything, their cities, their weapon sites, their population centers. If they want to fight dirty, we'll show them what real savagery looks like. Burn their world until nothing but cinders are left. But sir, our mission parameters were to— The Council isn't down here facing this, Vorthol shrieked, his last shred of composure shattering. I am. And my order is to turn this cursed rock into a floating piece of charcoal. The order was sent. The last ships of the Varith fleet began powering up their main weapons. But humanity had one last card to play. Tucked away in a secret bunker deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, a weapon beyond anyone's imagination was humming to life. It wasn't a bomb, and it wasn't a plague. It was something that tore up the laws of physics and threw them in the trash. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the genius behind Project Prometheus, had poured 30 years of her life into building this machine. It was designed to do one thing: rip a hole straight through the fabric of space and time. Is the facility secure? She asked her young assistant Maria. Yes, doctor. We're the only ones left. Everyone else is clear. Okay then, let's bring it online. Maria paused, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Doctor, we've never pushed it to 100% power. We don't actually know what will happen. Rodriguez gave her a small, sad smile. Oh, I have a pretty good idea what's going to happen. We're about to create a wound in reality itself. A wound so massive it'll yank every single enemy ship from the sky and crush it into nothing. And it'll take us with it? Maria asked quietly. It'll take us with it, Rodriguez confirmed. It needs a guiding hand right until the very last second. There's no way to automate the final stage. She looked at her assistant with kind eyes. You should go, Maria. Get out of here. I can finish this alone. The young woman stood a little taller. No, I'm staying. Someone has to monitor the power relays. Besides, she added with a heavy sense of peace, I don't have family waiting for me topside. This is as good an end as any. Rodriguez gave her a look that was overflowing with gratitude and then gave a firm nod. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Doctor. They both swiveled back to their control panels and began the final countdown. Far above their heads, superheated plasma rained from the sky, flash-boiling oceans and turning entire cities to molten slag. Millions of people were extinguished in a heartbeat. But deep underground, 2 women watched their screens, waiting for the perfect moment. The fleet's converging, Maria shouted. They're focusing their attack on the east coast, right over our heads. Perfect, Rodriguez said, her fingers flying across the console. They've all gathered in one place for their own funeral. Do it, Maria. Hit it now. Maria slammed her palm down on the big red activation button. For a single terrifying second, there was absolute silence. Then, every alarm in the bunker shrieked at once as the energy readings went completely off the scale. The mountain itself seemed to groan and shake around them. It's working, Rodriguez whispered, her voice filled with a terrible awe. My God, it's actually working. In orbit, the Varith fleet was violently ripped sideways. Sirens blared on every bridge as an invisible, unstoppable force began pulling them. Ship engines strained to their breaking point, threatening to tear the vessels apart, but it was no use. One after another, the warships were dragged toward the middle of their formation, where reality itself was coming undone. A hole of pure, silent blackness was tearing itself open in space. It wasn't a wormhole. It was an injury, a complete absence of everything that devoured light, matter, and time itself.
What in the stars is that thing?
High Commander Vorthel screamed from his captain's chair as his own ship began to shudder and buckle under the strain.
Unknown,
his tactical officer yelled back over the chaos.
Our sensors can't read it. It's eating the fleet.
The hole grew, setting off a chain reaction. The immense energy from the dying ships fed the anomaly, making it bigger, stronger, and more ravenous. It didn't just take out 300 ships. It devoured every last one. Vorthul's life ended in a high-pitched scream of pure terror as he watched the void fill his command window, pulling his flagship apart atom by atom. Deep beneath the earth, Dr. Rodriguez and Maria were vaporized in the resulting energy surge, their sacrifice saving billions of souls. On the surface, the surviving Varith ground troops could only stare at the sky as their fleet, their entire glorious armada, just vanished. They were stranded, leaderless, and absolutely terrified. They had come as conquerors, expecting to crush a primitive civilization. Instead, they had just kicked over a hornet's nest the size of a planet. President Chen watched the final report on the main view screen, her face a mask of stone. The war was over. Earth was scarred, broken, and mourning the loss of millions, but it was safe. We had won. The cost was almost unbearable, but the message was now burned into the stars for any other wannabe conquerors to see. You can push humanity into a corner, but you will not like what pushes back. What do you do when you realize you've already lost? If you're the alien invaders called the Varith, you decide your only option is to burn the whole planet to ash. That was the impossible situation humanity found itself in. The scars from this war would last for generations, but we never, ever gave up. From underground bunkers and hidden caves, from the rubble of our cities and the embers of our forests, we fought back. We would ambush their patrols, sabotage their supply lines, and die in the thousands. But for every one of us they took down, we made sure to take 10 of them with us. The Varith came here expecting a cakewalk. What they got was a species that would rather go extinct than ever bow down. And their real nightmare was just getting started. Stick around to find out how we gave them a war they would never, ever be able to forget. By the 4th day, High Commander Varith had given up on sleep. He just stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, staring at the battle maps with eyes that were sunken and hollow from pure, unfiltered exhaustion. The numbers on those screens were telling a story that his brain refused to process. A story that broke every known rule of warfare. He had arrived at Earth with 9,900 warships. He was now down to less than 7,000. More than 3,000 ships, each one a pinnacle of Varith technology, had been reduced to floating scrap by a race that shouldn't have been able to dent their hulls. We just lost another ground patrol in the southern Asian sector, his second-in-command Taranth reported, his voice utterly dead. He was just a machine reciting facts now, too tired to feel the horror of his own words. 500 soldiers, wiped out. The humans hit them with some kind of chemical agent that ate right through their armor. What kind of agent? Varith demanded. Our science teams are still trying to figure it out, Taranth replied. It looks like it's based on fluorine. It's unbelievably corrosive, and it seems like it was specifically designed to react with the alloys in our battlesuits. How are they creating new weapons this fast? Vorith whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Taranth didn't have an answer. Nobody did. The simple, terrifying truth was that the Varith had never met anyone like humans before. Every other species they had conquered fought with predictable strategies. They had organized armies, with leaders you could assassinate. Their weapons came from government research labs. They used tactics you could find in a textbook. But humans? Humans set the textbook on fire. In every destroyed city, in every small town, in every single refugee camp, people were innovating on the fly. Scientists who had never even spoken to each other were solving the same problems at the same time, creating dozens of different, lethal answers.
Soldiers were taking their standard-issue rifles apart in the middle of a firefight, slapping together new weapons from spare parts and captured alien tech. Teenagers were literally making bombs in their parents' basements. It was absolute chaos. It was total madness. And it was working with horrifying efficiency. An engineer hiding in Buenos Aires found a flaw in the Varith shield generators. Within hours, that info was blasted across the globe on a secret network. By the next morning, every human resistance fighter on the planet knew how to punch through their energy shields. A chemist in Mumbai whipped up a compound that could melt Varith armor like it was butter. A few days later, makeshift factories all over India were pumping it out and shipping it to the front lines. A kid in Seoul figured out how to hack their private communication channels. The aliens had a simple playbook that had worked on 2,000 different planets. Find the leader, take them out, and watch the army crumble. But they'd never faced an enemy like us. Humanity didn't have one leader. We were a hydra. For every head they cut off, 10 more grew in its place. For every city they flattened, 100 small towns rose up to continue the fight. "They're learning faster than we can adapt," Commander Torrance said, his voice laced with dread. "Our strategies are useless in hours. They're countering our weapons almost as soon as we fire them. I've never seen anything like it." His superior, Vorith, snarled, "Then we'll do something they can't counter, something final." "What are you suggesting, High Commander?" Torrance asked. Vorith turned to his chief science officer. "Tell me, how long would it take to crack this planet's crust? I want to unleash enough geological hell to make the surface completely uninhabitable." The scientist's face went white. "Sir, that would sterilize the entire world. It would be decades before the surface was stable. We'd be left with nothing but a dead rock." "Right now," Vorith snapped, "I'd take a dead rock over this nightmare. How long?" "Roughly 2 days," the scientist stammered. 2 days of continuous, concentrated fire from orbit, aimed at the major tectonic plates. "Then do it," Vorith commanded. Torrance stepped forward immediately. "High Commander, I must object. The Dominion Council sent us here to conquer this world, not turn it to ash. If we return home with a pile of dust, the Council will have our heads," Torrance warned. "If we don't return at all," Vorith shot back, "then we won't have to worry about that, will we?" He locked eyes with his second-in-command. "We are losing, Torrance. I know it, you know it, and every officer in this fleet knows it. We can't win a ground war, so we either crack this planet open like an egg, or we run home and admit that a pack of primitives sent us packing." "Then perhaps we should withdraw," Torrance urged. "We report that this species drove us off, that 9,000 of our most advanced warships couldn't take one tiny, insignificant world." Vorith just shook his head. "No, I'd rather die here than live with that shame. My decision stands. Begin the bombardment." Torrance stared at his commander, and for the first time in all their years of service, he saw something truly frightening in Vorith's eyes. It wasn't just anger or exhaustion. It was the look of a man who was completely and utterly broken. Vorith had been a conqueror for 300 years. His entire identity was built on an unbroken chain of victories. The very idea of failure was a poison, and it was eating him alive. Finally, Torrance gave a slow, defeated nod. "As you command." He turned to relay the order, a death sentence for every living soul on the planet below. Billions of people were about to be extinguished simply because they refused to give up. But Torrance was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. At least that's what he'd always told himself. Down on Earth, a teenage hacker in Seoul had done his job a little too well. Human intelligence intercepted the Varith command almost instantly. The report landed on President Shen's desk less than a minute later. She listened to the translated audio, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. "They're going to shatter the planet," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "They know they can't win, so they're going to murder us all." "Madam President, we have to respond," General Stone urged. "We can't stop that kind of orbital attack. Our weapons can't reach their fleet, and we don't have a single ship left in space." "I'm aware of that, General," she said. "So what's our move?" President Shen fell silent for a long, heavy moment. She thought of her sister, lost to the cold void of space in the very first attack.
She thought of the millions, both soldiers and civilians, who had already sacrificed their lives. She thought of everything humanity had endured just to stay in the fight. In that instant, her decision was forged in steel. "General, how many of our special assault teams are still combat ready?" "About a dozen units are still operational," he reported. "Most are scattered, fighting a guerrilla war." "Recall them," she commanded. "Pull every last one. I have a new target." "What kind of target?" Stone asked. Shen's gaze drifted to the tactical map, to the swarm of red icons hanging over their world like vultures. Thousands of them. Any one of those ships could wipe a city from existence. It was an impossible target. But humanity had stopped playing by the rules a long time ago. "We're going to board their flagship," she announced, her voice cold as iron. "We're going to take out their commander, and we are going to show them that no matter how high they fly or how far they run, we will find them, and we will make them pay." General Stone just stared at her, dumbfounded. "That's a suicide mission. We don't have ships that can get our people up there." "We have their ships," she countered. "Our teams on the ground have been capturing Vareth equipment, vehicles. Some have even managed to snag a few of their shuttles." "Stolen shuttles with stolen codes," Stone argued. "They'll see them coming a mile away." "Not if we launch the biggest, loudest, and most insane distraction in the history of warfare at the exact same time," she explained. "Something so massive they won't notice a few small shuttles slipping through the chaos." The general considered it. The plan was pure insanity. It was a Hail Mary pass from your own end zone with 1 second on the clock. In other words, it was a perfectly human plan. "What kind of distraction are we talking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Everything we have left, every missile, every gun, every last aircraft that can still fly. We throw it all at them in one massive, desperate wave. And while they're weathering that storm, our teams sneak aboard the flagship." "And if the teams fail?" Stone asked quietly. "Then we were all going to die anyway," she replied, her face grim. "At least this way, we die swinging." Stone gave a slow, determined nod. "I'll get the orders out." "Do it now," she said. "The clock is ticking." While the president set her impossible plan in motion, another was already taking shape on the ground. In the ruins of what used to be Chicago, a team of 50 soldiers was gearing up for a mission they knew they wouldn't be coming back from. They were the Hellhounds, one of the most decorated special ops units in the military. They'd been bleeding the Vareth dry since day one, ambushing patrols and wrecking supply lines. Their new objective: board the enemy flagship, eliminate the commander, and save the world. No big deal. Their leader was Sergeant Maria Santos. She was 32, with dark hair and eyes that had seen far too much war. The aliens had taken everything from her in the first attack: her husband, her 2 small children, her entire family. All of them erased in a single silent flash of light. She had absolutely nothing left to live for, which made her the perfect person to die for everyone else. "All right, listen up," she said, her voice as steady as granite. "This is it. 1 shuttle, 1 chance to get on that ship, and 1 shot at their commander. If we screw this up, it's over for everyone. But if we pull this off, we might just buy the folks back home the time they need to win this thing." "Sarge, how do we get past their security?" a young soldier asked, his voice trembling slightly. "That ship has a crew of 10,000. Even if we make it on board, we'll be outnumbered 200 to 1. "We don't have to fight 10,000, she replied coolly. "We just have to get to the bridge. Intel says their entire command structure is centralized. We take out their commander, and the whole fleet falls into chaos. After that, we blow the ship's reactor and take as many of those bastards with us as we can." The young soldier just nodded. He couldn't have been more than 20, a kid who was still in boot camp when the sky fell. But his eyes were hard as flint, his hands perfectly still. This war had forged him into something else. "Let's do this," he said. Sergeant Santos looked over her team. 50 soldiers, every single one a volunteer who knew this was a one-way trip. They came from every branch, every walk of life. grizzled veterans standing next to fresh-faced kids. The only thing they all had in common was the willingness to burn their own lives to give the world one more day. "Your wheel's up in 1 hour," Santos said, her voice like gravel. "Pack your gear, make peace with your gods, and write those letters home, because when we get upstairs, I want you to remember exactly who we're fighting for. Think of every single person we've lost, and get ready to make them regret ever looking at our sky." That hour vanished in what felt like a single heartbeat. Way too fast. Next thing she knew, Santos was buckled into the belly of a stolen enemy dropship, watching her home, the Earth, shrink into a beautiful blue marble below. The ship rocketed through the atmosphere, pinging out stolen security credentials to any alien vessel that challenged it. For now, the codes were holding. The Vareth were too distracted by the massive, desperate attack President Shen had launched to even notice one little sparrow slipping through their net. Through the viewport, Santos watched the war unfold. Thousands of missiles climbed from the planet's surface like a swarm of furious fireflies, all racing toward the enemy fleet. Squadrons of fighter jets screamed past on one-way missions, their pilots knowing they had zero chance of coming back, but hitting the enemy with everything they had anyway. It was the most beautiful and the most gut-wrenching thing she had ever seen. As they neared the massive flagship, the pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "We're being hailed." "Feed them the codes," Santos ordered. "I am. They're buying it. They're directing us to a landing bay on the port side." "Take us home." The dropship slid into the hangar of the Eternal Conquest without a hitch. Santos waited, listening for the heavy groan of the bay doors sealing shut behind them before she gave her next command. "Go, fast and quiet. Neutralize anyone you see." The hellhounds swarmed from the shuttle like phantoms released from a cage, flowing through the ship's corridors with a terrifying speed and deadly purpose. Have you ever watched your world burn, helpless against an enemy you can't even reach? For 6 straight days, that was our reality. They called us primitive. They called us insects. But they made one colossal mistake. They cornered us. And that's why right now, a handful of ghosts armed with the enemy's own tech are moving like ghosts through the guts of their command ship. You're about to witness what happens when the hunted learns how to hunt. A silenced shot, the whisper of a combat knife, the ugly snap of a neck in the shadows. That was their symphony. The Varath soldiers crumpled without so much as a sigh, completely blindsided inside their own fortress. They were so fixated on the human fleet hammering uselessly against their shields outside, they never imagined the wolves were already in the flock. By the time the first real alarms began to shriek, Sergeant Santos and her squad were already closing in on the bridge. "Contacts, straight ahead," a scout whispered over the comms. "Security checkpoint. I'm counting 20 guards." "Grenades," Santos commanded, her voice pure ice. "On my signal." In perfect lethal unison, every soldier pulled a pin. The hallway exploded in a blinding storm of light and shrapnel, vaporizing most of the guards in one violent flash. The handful left standing were cut down by precision gunfire before they could even process what had happened. This team, the unit they called the Hellhounds, pushed forward, leaving only silence and ruin behind them. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the warship Eternal Conquest, High Commander Vorthkul was completely ignoring the unfolding chaos on his own vessel. His eyes were glued to the spectacular space battle displayed on the main view screen. "Their assault is a pathetic failure," he gloated to his second-in-command. "Our shields are unbreakable. Their primitive weapons can't even scratch our hull." "Indeed, High Commander," Torrent replied, though a hint of caution colored his voice. "But we are losing some escort ships. They are targeting our weaker points with disturbing accuracy." Vorthkul just waved a dismissive hand. "Insignificant. As long as this flagship stands, the fleet is invincible. Continue preparations for glassing the planet." "High Commander, I'm getting reports of weapons fire from within the ship. Our security teams in Sector 9 are not responding." Vorthkul finally tore his gaze away from the light show of the battle. "What did you just say?" "It appears humans have boarded the ship, sir. They are fighting their way toward the bridge." For a second, the words just didn't register. Humans? Aboard his ship? That was impossible. No transport could have possibly gotten through their blockade. But then he remembered the sheer chaos of the battle, the thousands of false sensor readings jamming their systems, the overwhelming assault that had forced every single crew member to look outward, not inward. It was all a sleight of hand. The entire spectacular battle was just misdirection, a grand performance designed to sneak a few soldiers inside. "How many of them are there?" he snarled. "We are unsure. Initial estimates suggest fewer than 100. 100 soldiers against his crew of 10,000? Vorthkul actually let out a harsh, grating laugh. "They are insane. Deploy every security team we have. I want their skulls mounted on the wall." But the Hellhounds weren't waiting around to be trapped. They moved with a brutal efficiency that the Vareth forces couldn't seem to counter. Every passing second brought them closer to their goal. Santos led the charge. She'd already lost 10 soldiers getting this far, and 10 more were injured, but they were almost there. She could see the massive, reinforced doors to the bridge at the end of the hall. They looked like the gates to a fortress forged from solid metal. "Explosives!" she yelled. "Get that door open now!" Her demolitions expert slapped breaching charges onto the doorframe, while the rest of the squad laid down a desperate wall of cover fire, holding back the Vareth security forces now swarming their position. The hallway turned into a kill zone, bodies piling high as the humans refused to yield a single inch. "Charges are set! Everyone get back!" The blast was deafening, ripping the enormous doors clean off their hinges. Before the twisted metal had even crashed to the deck, Santos was diving through the smoke, her rifle barking at anything that moved. The bridge was utter chaos. Officers scrambled for their sidearms, guards tried to form a defensive perimeter. And there, standing in the center of it all, framed by the view screen showing her burning home world, was the alien monster who had ordered its destruction, Vorthkul. Santos didn't hesitate. She brought her rifle up and fired. The round slammed into Vorthkul's chest, staggering him. But the Vareth were built like tanks. They could absorb punishment that would kill a human 10 times over. He was still on his feet, reaching for his own weapon. Santos fired again, and again, and again. Each shot hammered Vorthkul backward, his green blood spattering across the polished command deck. All 4 of his eyes were wide with disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was a conqueror of galaxies. He couldn't die like this, at the hands of these primitives. But he was dying. He could feel his life force draining away. "You," he managed to choke out. "You're nothing but animals." Santos walked straight toward him, ignoring her own wounds. She was covered in cuts and burns, but her eyes were like cold diamonds, and her hands were rock steady. "We're humans," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And we don't know the meaning of surrender." She pressed the barrel of her rifle against his forehead and pulled the trigger. High Commander Vorthkul, conqueror of 2,000 systems, died on the bridge of his own ship, executed by a member of a species he had dismissed as a nuisance. Santos had no time to enjoy the victory. More Varath were pouring onto the bridge. She glanced at her surviving soldiers. Only 6 of them left, just 6. "Plant charges on the main reactor," she ordered. "Every last ounce we have." "Sergeant, if we blow the reactor this close to the planet—" "I know," she said, a sad, resolute smile touching her lips. "This was always a one-way trip. Let's make it worth it." The explosives were set. The timer began its final, silent countdown. Santos found a security camera, its small red light blinking, and she stared right into its lens. She knew that somewhere, down on the world she was about to save, her people were watching. "Tell the president we got him," she said, her voice ringing with clarity and strength. "Tell her the Hellhounds send their regards." She snapped her hand up in one last crisp salute. The reactor went critical. The eternal conquest was ripped apart from the inside. The explosion vaporized the bridge, the corridors, and every single deck in an expanding sphere of pure energy. It cascaded outward, a tidal wave of fire that consumed everything in its path. Secondary explosions erupted as munitions and fuel lines ignited, turning the massive warship into a chain reaction of brilliant, lethal fireworks. The flagship disintegrated into a million glowing embers, and when the light finally cleared, there was nothing left but a silent, expanding cloud of cosmic dust. In orbit, high above the Earth, the Vareth fleet was suddenly a serpent without a head. Ships that had moved with a single, deadly purpose now drifted without direction. Captains who had followed orders without question suddenly had no one to give them. The perfect, brutal chain of command had been shattered. Down on Earth, President Chen watched the enemy flagship icon vanish from a tactical display. She watched the impossible sacrifice of her soldiers bear fruit, and for the first time in a week, she allowed a tiny, fragile seed of hope to grow in her heart. The war was far from over, but for the first time, she truly believed that humanity just might survive. "Godspeed, Sergeant Santos," she whispered to the empty space on the screen. "Godspeed to all of you." And somewhere in the fiery ghost of the eternal conquest, Maria Santos smiled one last time before the flames carried her home. She had won. How does a species with slingshots beat a galactic empire with starships? Well, for 6 straight days, the Vareth fleet moved as one, a single, unstoppable force guided by the iron will of High Commander Vorthkul. Their command structure was perfect, their victory all but guaranteed. But then, a handful of humans did the impossible, and that perfect structure shattered into a million pieces. On the emergency bridge of his cruiser, the newly promoted Commander Torinth, the highest-ranking officer left alive, stared at the empty space where his leader's flagship used to be. "Tell me," he demanded, "what's the damage?" The tactical officer's voice trembled. The flagship and 93 escort vessels were vaporized in the blast. High Commander Vorthkul and the entire command staff. "They're gone, sir." "And our fleet?" Torinth asked, his voice hollow. "We stand at roughly 6,800 ships, Commander. We started this invasion with 9,900. Torinth squeezed his eyes shut. More than 3,000 ships lost, millions of his soldiers dead, and they hadn't even taken the planet. Every time they thought they had the humans cornered, they would pull off some unbelievable trick. Now, a tiny suicide squad, 50 soldiers at most, had just assassinated the most protected man in the galaxy. In 200 years of crushing star systems, Commander Torinth had never witnessed anything so impossible. The humans had died, sure, but in doing so, they had just landed the biggest blow in galactic history. He was supposed to be a conqueror, but standing there, he just felt like a survivor. How could a species this outmatched push an empire to the brink of chaos? "Commander," the tactical officer repeated, his voice shaking, "your orders?" Torinth was silent. He remembered his old commander's final order, to crack the planet open. He thought of the council back home, so confident in this easy victory, and he thought of the humans. He'd studied them, and he'd seen a fire that no military manual could explain. He'd watched soldiers literally smiling as they charged into plasma fire that would instantly turn them to ash. He'd seen civilians in street clothes throwing broken pieces of buildings at his advanced war machines. He'd even seen children, actual kids, strapping bombs to themselves to take out a single one of his squads. This wasn't a species fighting to win. This was a species fighting to make the Vareth bleed for every single inch of ground. For them, every ship they took down, every soldier they killed, that was a victory. They would fight until the last human heart stopped beating, and even then, Torinth had a sick feeling they'd find a way to keep going. "Commander?" The officer's voice snapped him back. Torinth's eyes focused. "Signal the fleet," he said, his voice now flat and empty. "We're leaving." A stunned silence fell over the bridge. Every single officer spun around to face him, their faces a mask of pure disbelief. "Sir, did you just order a retreat?" "I did," Torinth confirmed. "This is a war we can't win. Every day we linger here, we lose more. These humans have weapons that shouldn't exist, tactics we can't predict, and a will to fight that is absolutely terrifying. If we stay, this planet will be our tomb." "But the Dominion Council," another officer started. "The Council isn't here,"
Torrance roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "They aren't watching our people get butchered by the thousands. I am. I am in command now, and I say we are finished." He fixed his gaze on the communications officer. "Send the order to every ship. All units will cease fire and prepare for an immediate jump to hyperspace. All ground troops are to pull back to their transports now. We are gone in 2 hours." "Yes, Commander." The command shot across the system. On the bridges of thousands of ships, captains reacted with a mixture of shock and overwhelming relief. Some were just grateful to escape the nightmare. Others burned with shame, feeling like they were betraying their fallen friends. But not one of them hesitated. Torrance was in command. Down on the planet, the massive Vareth war machine sputtered, halted, and began its slow, humiliating journey backward. Soldiers who had only ever known how to advance were now pulling back. The humans watched, their suspicions so thick you could feel it. Was this a trick? Some new, clever trap? Miles beneath the surface, President Chen stared at the battlefield data, her mind struggling to catch up. "They're actually leaving?" she whispered, her voice raw. "They're just walking away?" "It seems so, Madam President," General Stone replied, his own voice tight with awe. "Our satellites confirm their fleet is pulling back beyond the moon. They're getting into a jump formation." "But why? They still have thousands of ships. They could have shattered this planet from orbit like they threatened to." "I think Sergeant Santos's mission did more than take out their commander, ma'am. She broke their will." Chen let the words hang in the air. The Vareth had never known true defeat. They'd never met an enemy that could punch back this hard. The assassination of their supreme leader by a tiny suicide squad must have terrified them. If a few humans could do that, what else were they capable of? The Vareth weren't running because they were losing. They were running because they were afraid. "Keep eyes on them," Chen ordered, her voice turning to steel. "I want to be 100% sure they are gone. If they even think about turning around, I want you to throw everything we have left at them." "Yes, Madam President." In orbit, Torrance watched his battered fleet limp into position for the jump. The withdrawal was a nightmare. Reports from the ground were getting worse by the second. "Commander, our ground forces are taking heavy casualties," an officer shouted. "The humans aren't giving them an inch." "Tell them to fight their way out," Torrance ordered through clenched teeth. "We leave no one behind." "Sir, that will cost us even more lives." "I know," Torrance said quietly. "Give the order." Of course, the humans wouldn't make it easy. Even in their moment of victory, they were determined to exact every last drop of blood. A strange, bitter respect grew in Torrance's heart. These weren't primitives. They were warriors. As the agonizing hours ticked by, the fleet shrank. Ships too damaged to make the jump were abandoned. Soldiers who couldn't make it to a transport were left behind. It was cold and brutal, but it was necessary. When the last possible ship was in position, Torrance asked for the final count. "Fleet strength is at 4,200 ships, the officer reported, his voice hollow. "We managed to extract about 1.5 million ground troops." 4,000 ships. They had arrived with nearly 10,000. More than half the fleet was gone, destroyed in battle or left as floating metal coffins. "And our losses?" Torrance asked. "It's hard to be exact, Commander. But initial reports put our dead at around 3 million, and that's not counting High Commander Vorthkul and his entire staff." 3 million souls, lost on a planet they thought would be conquered in an afternoon. Torrance gave a slow, heavy nod. "Initiate the jump to hyperspace." "Yes, Commander." Across the formation, massive engines whined to life, preparing to tear a hole through reality itself. And in that final vulnerable moment, the humans unleashed utter hell. They came from everywhere. Missiles hidden in battlefield debris roared to life. Drones that had been playing dead suddenly activated, and weapon systems on the moon that had gone silent for days fired one last devastating volley. The Vareth had to lower their shields to jump. The humans knew it, and they were waiting. It was a massacre. Our ships were being ripped apart before they could even fire back. Railgun slugs, moving at a fraction of light speed, punched through armored hulls like they were wet cardboard. Missiles found their way to engine cores, turning mighty warships into silent, expanding fireballs. Beams of pure plasma sliced through entire formations, and ships simply melted into glowing space junk. "All vessels, emergency jump!" Commander Torranth's voice cracked over the comms. "Jump now! Run!" All around him, the fleet was in chaos. Shimmering purple portals to hyperspace tore open in the void, and his ships dove for them like terrified fish. But the humans had one more nightmare waiting for us. Gravitational mines, hidden near the escape route, flickered to life. They twisted the fabric of space, turning the portals into death traps. The ships jumping through weren't escaping. They were being shredded. Their crews died screaming as their vessels were stretched into noodles and simultaneously crushed into nothing by the universe turning against itself. Torranth could only watch in frozen horror as his armada was systematically deleted from existence. Ships he'd called home for centuries, crews that were like family, gone in the blink of an eye. "Recalculate. Find us another way out," he roared. "Find a clean path out of this hell." "I'm trying, sir. The distortions are everywhere," his navigator cried back. More ships exploded. The humans were throwing everything they had at us. It was their last hateful act of defiance, and it was devastatingly effective. The flagship, the Blade of Justice, rocked violently as a railgun slug scraped against its shields. Torranth gripped the arms of his command chair, trying to keep the sheer terror off his face. "Give me a status update. I found one. Jump coordinates are locked. We have a clear window, but it's closing fast. We're going to lose more ships getting there." "Take it," he commanded. "All ships, follow my lead." The Blade of Justice shot toward the new jump point, what was left of the fleet struggling to form up behind it. The humans didn't let up. They just kept firing, kept killing. The portal loomed larger. Torranth watched the tactical map, his heart sinking as the count of friendly ships plummeted. 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. The Blade of Justice finally burst through the portal, and the universe dissolved into a tunnel of purple light, leaving the slaughter far behind. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Torranth let himself take a breath. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, afraid of the answer. "How many made it?" The tactical officer just stared at his screen, his face as white as a sheet. 17, Commander," he choked out. 17 ships. 17. Out of 9,900. Torranth fell back into his chair, the silence in the bridge heavier than a dying star. There was nothing left to say. The invasion of Earth was over. The Vath had lost. The trip back to their home space took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of hollow silence, of grief, and of trying to make sense of what had happened. Torranth spent most of it locked away, writing his official report for the Dominion Council, the hardest words he'd ever have to put down. He wrote about human technology that seemed to operate on pure magic. He wrote about their brilliant strategies, their ability to learn and counter our tactics faster than any species on record. He tried to describe their raw, furious determination, their absolute refusal to surrender even when facing total destruction. And then he wrote his final, bone-chilling recommendation. When the 17 battered ships finally limped back to the Dominion capital, a pristine escort fleet met them and guided them directly to the council chambers. Moments later, Torranth was standing before the masters of the Dominion, the most powerful beings in 3 galaxies. Their eyes burned with contempt. To them, he was a failure, a coward who had tucked his tail and run. He had stained the honor of the Dominion. "Explain yourself, Commander," the High Counselor hissed. "Explain how you lost an entire fleet to a planet of mud-dwelling primitives." Torranth held his gaze. "Can you imagine launching an attack with 10,000 of your best warships, sent to conquer a backwater planet that shouldn't even be a challenge? Now, imagine only 17 of them make it home, beaten and broken." That's the reality Commander Torranth was facing as he stood before the council, knowing his next words could be his last. But they had to be said. "They are not primitives," he began, his voice steady even as his hands trembled. "They only seem that way because they haven't bothered with space travel. Their technology advances at a terrifying rate. Their tactics are beyond clever, and their will to fight, it is a fire we have never seen before. You sent me with 10,000 ships. They tore us to pieces.
We wiped out millions of them, and it just made them fight harder. We turned their cities to glass, and they kept fighting. We bombed their planet from orbit, and they just kept coming. They do not surrender. I don't think they even know how. They fight until they win, or until every last one of them is dead. The council chamber was utterly silent, until one of them scoffed. Then we'll send a larger fleet, 20,000 ships or 30,000, whatever it takes. Torrance slowly shook his head, the movement heavy with the experience of 200 years of war. It will make no difference. You could send our entire armada, and it still wouldn't be enough. By the time that fleet arrived, the humans would have new weapons, new defenses. They will have learned from every single one of our mistakes. They will be stronger. He looked from one council member to the next. I have fought wars for 2 centuries. I've conquered worlds that would make your blood run cold. But I've never faced an enemy like the humans. They aren't like us. They aren't like any species we've ever met. They are something else, something truly frightening. The High Counselor leaned forward, his voice a low growl. Then what is your recommendation, Commander? Torrance took a long, steadying breath. Leave them alone, at all costs. Do not provoke them again. Give them no reason to ever look in our direction. If possible, we should wipe all records of our own existence from their view. Abandon that planet and pray to any gods you hold dear that they never decide to come looking for us. The room exploded into shouting. Council members leaped to their feet, calling him a coward, a traitor. Torrance didn't flinch. I'm telling you the simple truth, he yelled over the noise. You can kill me for it, but it won't change the facts. We attacked their home, a world they call Earth, with 9,900 of our finest warships. 17 came back. 17! That is the reality you have to face. The High Counselor slammed his fist, demanding silence. You truly believe they are that great a threat? Torrance's expression was carved from stone. I believe they are the single greatest threat our empire has ever known. And it's not their technology or their ships, he continued. It's who they are. They're survivors. They adapt. They learn. They take punishment that would break any other race, and they just get back up, even stronger. They never, ever quit. His mind flashed back to the chaos on his own bridge. He saw the face of a human soldier, a woman who had somehow gotten aboard, and she was smiling as she single-handedly defeated the High Commander. If we go back, we will be wiped out. That's not a guess. That is a guarantee. The Council argued for hours, but in the end, fear won. Humanity was officially declared a forbidden species. Their homeworld was marked in the Dominion charts with the highest threat level possible. A new permanent order was issued. All ships were to stay at least 10 light-years away from their solar system. As for Torrance, he was sentenced to exile for his catastrophic failure. He accepted it without a word. He had saved his remaining crews. He had given the warning. That was all he could do. As he boarded the ship that would carry him to a forgotten moon, he glanced back at the star charts. Out there, orbiting a small yellow sun, the humans were probably already rebuilding, learning, becoming more powerful. He had told the Council they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. But he hadn't told them the whole truth. He hadn't told them about the look in that human sergeant's eyes just before she defeated High Commander Vorul. It wasn't hate or anger or even fear. It was something else. Something Torrance had only ever seen in the heroes of his own people's oldest legends. It was pure, unadulterated joy. The humans didn't just fight to survive. They didn't just fight to protect their world. They fought because they loved it. Conflict was in their very soul, woven into their DNA. And now, because of the Dominion's monumental mistake, they knew they weren't alone in the universe. They knew the galaxy was full of new places to see, new challenges to meet, and new enemies to conquer. Torrance stared into the darkness and felt a cold dread wash over him. The Dominion Council actually thought their quarantine would work. They thought drawing a red line around Earth's solar system would keep them safe. What idiots! The humans would never stay put. They would build bigger and better ships.
Imagine a bully kicking down your door, not just any bully, but one with a fleet of nearly 10,000 state-of-the-art warships, while all you have are pea shooters and kitchen knives. That's exactly what the Dominion did to Earth 40 years ago. They saw our little blue planet as an easy target, a quick conquest. They were wrong. And if you want to find out just how catastrophically wrong they were, stick around. Because this story isn't about our defeat. It's about the day the galaxy learned to fear us. That day, only 17 of their ships limped home, carrying a story so terrifying it would become a legend. What they told everyone was that humans didn't fight like anyone else. We charged headfirst into plasma cannons armed with little more than glorified rifles and chunks of sharpened steel. They said we smiled as we fell, knowing every sacrifice was a step towards victory. We didn't just win a war, we earned something far more valuable. Through fire and blood, we earned a reputation. We earned respect that was born from pure, unadulterated fear. And in a galaxy full of predators, fear is the only currency that truly matters. One of the new human ambassadors, a sharp young woman named Elena Santos, stopped in front of a giant memorial the Dominion had built for its fallen fleet. The monument was a colossal wall of black stone engraved with the names of every soldier and every single ship lost in their failed invasion of Earth. She traced a finger over the cold surface, her eyes scanning the endless list, before she turned to the trembling Dominion official beside her. "My grandmother fought in that war," she said, her voice surprisingly light and friendly. "She was actually the one who led the team that took out your high commander." The official's face went completely pale. I'm so deeply sorry for your family's loss." Elena just flashed a bright smile. "Oh, don't be. She went out on her own terms, fighting and winning." It was the exact same chilling smile her grandmother wore on the bridge of the enemy flagship, right before the lights went out for good. "We remember her as a hero," Elena continued, "one of the people who saved our entire species. I'm sure you remember her as something else." The official swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "We remember her as a warning." Elena's smile widened just a little. "Excellent. That's exactly what she would have wanted." She then continued her tour, leaving the official frozen in place, staring at the monument to his people's greatest mistake. He watched her walk away, that old familiar dread creeping back into his bones. The humans were here, smiling and signing treaties. But everyone knew what was just beneath the surface. They were the same terrifying force from the legends. The galaxy would never forget the day 9,900 warships swarmed a small blue world, and only 17 escaped to tell the tale. That story became a core piece of galactic wisdom. Do not provoke the humans, do not threaten their home, and never, ever mistake their politeness for weakness. Because when you back them into a corner, they don't just fight back, they never stop. And somehow, they always win.